This paper is a portion of a longer article which my abstract represents. It just, when I look into my abstract, I realize that it's quite impossible to present everything that is abstract. However, some of the subjects listed in my abstract will be addressed as I proceed. My main focus will, however, be on AI and the singularity. As you know, we just already discussed here, an explosion to ever greater levels of intelligence as each generations of machines or digital machines in particular creates more intelligent machines in turn made possible by the development of AI. So first, I would like to state very clearly what my paper is not, and then what it is. It is not a critique of technology, including digital technology, and not a discussion of the relationships between technology and human beings or society, which were very powerfully and wonderfully discussed already in this conference. Finally, just in case there's it could be a confusion, it is not a criticism of René Girard. Also, my argument is based on an alternative concept of desire that proposed by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, but it does not exclude Girard's concept of desire or those of his precursors, Freud and Lacan. I'm not a Girardian, but I think Girard's theory in effect support one of the main parts of my argument, and I will indicate that one a little bit before, right? As concerned what this paper is, it argues first that any human experience, as inner experience, as Georges Bataille called it, is unique and unrepeatable, and is ultimately inaccessible from outside, in accord with what Emmanuel Levinas called infinity, although we can make inferences about its content on the basis of some evidence which actually is recordable and repeatable. This is, even though will not develop it fully, parallel to quantum theory, where in contrast to classical physics, we cannot know and even conceive, there is no story to be told and no concept to be formed, how the experimental data that we observe or predict comes about. This parallel is amplified by the essential role of chance and probability in both quantum theory and in the question of inner experience as I see it here. Of course, quantum objects such as elementary particles do not have inner experience and desires, at least in my view, because there are some people who do actually say that electrons have consciousness or even thinking, because that actually helps to explain some of the quantum mysteries. Secondly, the paper argues that technological devices, machines of any kind available thus far, which can be defined, let's define the machine here as negentropic, as a word introduced by Schrödinger, negentropic, order-creating system created by human other than biologically based, are not capable, that's my thesis, are not capable of desire and thus of inner experience. And as a result, I argue they're not capable of thought, at least of the type we have as human. Third, finally, in view of this consideration, the paper argues that despite the capacity of digital technology to perform many tasks that we cannot perform as human, and AI reaching the level of human thinking and thus and therefore the singularity in this sense are unlikely, even highly unlikely. This is not the same as impossible. It is really, that's part of my argument, a matter of betting on or against with one degree of belief or another on this type of possibilities. The degree of belief is actually the Bayesian definition of probability, which I adopt in this paper, right? The probability measures the degree of belief into something. So my argument here is that my own degree of belief in the possibility of that type of AI, some people call it high AI, and singularity is quite low. So this argument in this paper is in part a critical response to the argument concerning AI and Singularity made a few years ago by David Chalmers of the hard problem of consciousness fame. I argue actually that his argument concerning AI, which he estimates much more positively than I do in Singularity, is made much more difficult that Chalmers appears to think precisely by the hard problem. So the hard problem is that of establishing how a neurobiology and ultimately physics of the brain makes thinking and or consciousness as we experience it possible. It is the problem of scientifically explaining our experience, any stream of thought, as defined by the so-called qualia, qualitative phenomenal properties. Chalmers contrasts the hard problem with the easy problems, which can be tackled by approaches that we commonly use in science, seeking explanation in terms of functioning, a concept functioning that is independent from the concept of experience and is, he argues, useless for the problem of experience. Thus he says, quote, why is the performance by the brain of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all of this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? There is an explanatory gap between the function and the experience. One model for conceptual gap between experience and functioning is that of zombie, which he favors, which, while behaviorally indistinguishable from a human zombie, while behaviorally indistinguishable from a human being, nevertheless has no inner experience. Of course, we don't know if zombies, especially zombies that possess all aspects of manifested human behavior, actually exist, although Chalmers appeared to be that they might. Now, the second model, the same question arises in the case of the digital AI, at least that concern those behaviors of computer that we associate with the effect of thinking, as in the so-called Turing test. That is, the question is whether a computer can actually think in the way humans do, even though we can see them performing many functions that humans do, even linguistically, right? So now the hard problem, and here really my important part of my argument begins, the hard problem is designated as the hard problem of consciousness rather than thinking, because I believe our manifested experience is that of consciousness and not that of the unconscious thinking inferred from our conscious thinking. Part of the hard problem is therefore how much of our thinking is conscious versus the unconscious, which both Freud and Lacan saw as thinking, Gedanken, that's Freud's terms for accompanying the unconscious. Conversely, they saw thinking as primarily unconscious. This makes the hard problem also, and even primarily the hard problem of the unconscious, which is indissociable, I argue, from the problem of desire. My hypothesis, and I claim no more for anything I propose in this paper, that there is no thinking without desire any more than desire. There is no thinking without desire any more than desire without thinking. This, I argue, what makes the possibility for AI to reach human level of intelligence or human kind of intelligence, which is in the first place thinking, much more complex. So in reality, basically, I'll come to that later. I think that machines, as I define them, as entropy, as negentropic devices which create order, are not capable of desire and therefore are not capable of thinking. Okay, so that's a kind of underlying simplified thesis. In asking the question, what is thinking, which is for them also the question, what is the brain? Deleuze and Guattari, and what is philosophy, define thought as opposed to merely thinking, say, understood in the sense of mental states we experience, as a confrontation between the brain and chaos. They argue that art, science, and philosophy are different, if sometimes interrelated ways in which thought confronts chaos by creating new concepts in philosophy, new compositions in art, and new logical structures in mathematics and science. There's a complex interplay between all of this, but I'll put that aside. Now they define how chaos itself as follows. Chaos, they say, is defined by not so much by disorder, but by the infinite speed with which every form taking place on it vanishes. It is a void that is not nothingness, but a virtual, containing all possible particles and drawing out all possible forms, which spring up only to disappear immediately without consistency or reference, without consequence. Now, clearly, virtual here doesn't refer to the current use of the term of the virtual reality in the sense of computers, but they could be connected. I don't have time to do that in this on this occasion. So, but this concept of chaos is actually quite unusual. Indeed, I am unaware of any of its previous appearances in philosophy. It appears to be derived by Deleuze and Guattari from quantum field theory, which introduced a new concept, that of virtual particle formation. The birth and disappearance of particles from the so-called false vacuum, a kind of sea of energy, thus suggesting the image of chaos invoked by Deleuze and Guattari. So this chaos, in a way, the word they favor, borrowing it from Joyce's Finnegan Wake, is a kind of chaosmos rather than simply chaos. The virtual is real. It's a form of the real, which always escapes thought, but gives rise to thought and help us as desiring machines of thought, as emphasis as desiring machines of thought, not the same as just machines which don't desire, to create and experience the actual. The virtual also defines the desire in the Deleuze and Guattari sense as against that of Freud and Lacan. I'll come into that momentarily. So for the moment, while chaos is thus a grand enemy of thought because it prevents thought from creating order, it is also a great friend of thought, even its greatest friend and its most important ally in thought, yet more profound struggle, that against opinion, doxa, an enemy only, which is, quote, like a sort of umbrella that protect us from chaos. And then he said, the misfortune of people comes from opinion. That's why, incidentally, in all our newspapers, we only have an opinion columns, but never thought columns. While capable, indeed more easily, of generating and obeying opinion, the brain could be a desiring machine of thought, or rather a manifold of such machine. That's why I think something like Girard, I'll come to that later, as well as Freud and Lacan, are not really strict, and Deleuze and Guattari never claimed that, not strictly in opposition, but in complex relationships with desiring machine in their sense, right? Now, this poses two questions. The first, which I can only mention here, is whether this capacity of brain as thought, as a confrontation of chaos, requires a new form of neuroscience, which thus far has only been able to account for the brain as the organ of creating opinion rather than a desiring machine of thought. So it appears. But the second question, which I address in this paper, from the perspective of Bayesian probability, both in workings of our brain and in our estimate made by our brains for the likelihood of AI in the singularity. In the ways my paper has this kind of dédoublement, because our betting of singularity, our concerns about singularity represents our brain as a probability machine. It's our assessment are really a part of it. The question is whether AI, thus far only capable of structural equivalence of opinions as algorithm, can give rise to desiring machine of thought. I would argue that we do not have other machine of thought as a confrontation with chaos, except desiring machine human and possibly animals. Apart from such machine, which are not machines, no AI or singularity is likely. My own Bayesian bet is the true AI, in which I would also stand for the equivalent of human subjectivity, the I of experience, is highly unlikely. Okay, now I return to singularity. So the singularity is an explosion to ever greater level of intelligence as each generation creates more intelligent machines made possible by the development of AI. It's the first step, artificial intelligence at the human level, and the necessary preconditions for this explosion. Then it is further assumed the AI then explode to AI plus, artificial intelligence greater than human, AI plus plus, artificial intelligence much greater than human, etc., potentially to infinity, thus leading to the singularity, reaching a level far exceeding human. The first question is whether AI is possible, and if so, how probable it is. Although Chalmers and others do not see the argument in terms of in these terms or reflect on this point, most such assessment, as I said, about betting on singularity, even when some predicted with certainty. These predictions are estimates and not reality. That is to say, I think it's a very important aspect of probability. It's always futural. You can predict something with certainty, but what you predict is not reality. It can only come into being, but it can always be defeated by the real, as Lacan actually argued. These predictions are estimates and not reality, which is reality is what has occurred and not what is predicted, unless one assumes something like what is called superdeterminism, in which all that will occur is predestined, which the present author of Chalmers do not assume, right? It may also be, so this bet on singularity may also be called the Singularity Wager, with Pascal's wager in mind. Actually, God is a form of singularity in Pascal's, I'm only talking about him, not unlike that AI with infinite number of pluses after that, which it reaches when it reaches near infinite intelligence, although arguably some visionary of computer technology might disagree. Only God intelligence can be truly infinite. As actually Spinoza contended in his short treatise on God, man, and human welfare, he called God's intelligence the, quote, the internal son of divine substance. So this, in a way, that the betting on singularity or on AI to begin with is at the core of Chalmers' article is hardly surprising. Indeed, it is unavoidable, given that one deals with an event, a singular, unique event whose probability is uncertain and has been contested for over half of a century. If one speaks only of the current digital form of AI, otherwise the debate is much longer. I mean, let me very briefly comment on that. The Bayesian probability allows you to deal with singular and individual event, as opposed to if you toss a coin 100 times, you could predict probability on the basis of frequency of occurrence. But singularity is a little bit like an outcome of the basketball game. You cannot be, it only happened once. You cannot really repeat it, or if you repeat it, it will be a different event. So betting enters Chalmers' article from the outset, perhaps imperceptibly for him, because I.J. Good's 1965 article, Speculations Concerning the First Ultra-Intelligent Machine, a famous article, set the argument for singularity and is the point of departure for Chalmers' article. Was obviously also a bet, as the word speculation in its title suggests. It's not coincidental that Good, who worked with Turing in Bletchley Park and was an expert in the field of computer intelligence and was a primary consultant of Stanley Kubrick on 2001, was actually also an expert on probability and statistics, and specifically on the Bayesian probability. So I think that's why, in a way, he knew very well about that aspect of it. So Bayesian, it's named after Thomas Bayes, who was a British mathematician and philosopher of 18th century, but the concept which I use here is 20th century, introduced by Bruno De Finetti. Bayesian approaches to probability define probability as a degree of belief. One deals with probability concerning individual event, estimated on the basis all information from all sources one has, which is called the prior, that can be used for such estimate rather than on a repetition of similar events, such as coin tosses occurring in sequence where our estimates are shaped most essentially by the outcome of the preceding events. That is to say, when you bet on the outcome of the basketball game, your betting is based on the basis all the information, including possibly some previous games, but you can bet on it as differently. And if you suddenly learn that in one of the team, the best player is injured and nobody else knows that, then you can change your bet and win some extra money, right? So I think, so Chalmers uses the Bayesian language when he says that his own credence, that his expression for the emergence of AI before 2100, so roughly, you wrote about less than a century, right? Is somewhat over 1/2. So give it as over 50%, right? The probabilistic language of expectation, likelihood, plausibility, and so forth, often with Bayesian overtone, permeates Chambers' article throughout. Bayesian's approaches also deals, incidentally, with more subjective aspects of probability. In a certain sense, according to Bayesian, all probability is subjective in a sense, even though we could share our expectations, but it's always our mind. In fact, that's part of my argument. I'm going to develop this part to that degree. Our inner experience is participating in estimation of probabilities on betting or anything, right? And our brain is actually Bayesian probabilistic machine. There is a neurological argument to that effect, but it is always part of our mind, right? The estimation of probability. So the prior is all the information you have. Part of Pascal's prior, for example, in his wager, would be that God might exist and the salvation might be possible, right? The priors of those who bet on or against AI are complex and might differ, but they would involve all the information and assumption about the capacity of both the human brains and computers. I'm primarily talking about digital AI, but for simplicity, right? Bayesian betting on or against AI is itself, I argue, part of the complexity of the human brain, and as I said, there is a concept of brain in terms of Bayesian probability, right? So I think what I argue here, so there is really an interesting twist that your brain is always defined by probability, and the estimates of the super brain is also this type of assessment. Now, in my view, a similar capacity for betting, the capacity to estimate probability, is necessary for any AI, a point on which I comment below. Briefly, although computers may perform calculation, often very complex, that help our estimates, computers do not make bets. Incidentally, the brief footnote, Nietzsche, in the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals, makes actually an extraordinary remark. Many of his remarks are extraordinary, saying that in creating humans being, nature fulfilled the task of creating an animal who is capable of making promises, which is precisely that extraordinary capacity, because if I promise you something, I could be certain, but in reality, you are always estimating the chances that my promise will be fulfilled. Now, the question that I want to ask now is, how does Chalmers, another argument, an expectation concerning the rise of AI and the singularity, update? In Bayesian probability is based on updating. If you get new information, then your bet can be changed, like in the case of basketball game, which I mentioned before. How does his argument update my information or those who are skeptical of the creation of AI. And my argument is going to be not very much. Chalmers, as I said, gives AI and singularity at least 50-50 or even better chance in about 100 years. He doesn't need to convince the proponents of AI or singularity. On the other hand, his argument is unlikely, I would argue, to convince those who are more skeptical, such as myself, and who give AI or the singularity a much lesser, if any, chance. Chalmers considers some reasons for a more skeptical view, but only as tempering his argument without affecting his expectations. Chalmers' credence is 50%, is my view, is too optimistic. As Chalmers observes, actually, most neuroscientists who deal with heart problem, how our experience is made possible by the brain, to which we don't have an answer, he said that they are skeptical about it, right? Still, even so, over one half in about century, let's say 50% chance, is a pretty uncertain chance. It's not really, he's wise to do that, right? Apart from the fact that Chalmers does not address some among the plausible reasons for skeptical assessment of the likelihood of AI at any point, or at least in the foreseeable future, some of the reasons that he does address, he only mentioned without really analyzing them. This lacuna reflects deeper and possibly insurmountable difficulty for the project of creating AI. For the sake of brevity, and because the rise of AI is the most crucial event, I just will talk for the moment about AI and not the singularity. I find especially wanting Chalmers' analysis of both neurological and evolutionary argument in support of his argument or ways in which his analysis may be resisted. Consider his evolutionary argument, his quote, right, from Chalmers. The evolutionary argument runs as follows. One, evolution produces human level of intelligence. That's true. Two, if evolution produced human level of intelligence, then we can produce AI before long. That's a separate matter, but he says that is the logic, right? Then he said, conclusions, absent defeater, there will be AI before long. And I'm still quoting him. Here the thought is that since evolution produced human level of intelligence, this sort of intelligence is not entirely unattainable. Furthermore, evolution operates without requiring the antecedent intelligence of forethought. If evolution can produce something in this unintelligent manner, then in principle, humans should be able to produce it much faster, Chalmers' emphasis, by using our intelligence, end quote. This last contention is, to me, not self-evidence. Why much faster? How much faster? Chalmers himself notes that his argument can be resisted, but again, only to bypass it. As he said, quote, the evolutionary argument could be resisted, A, by arguing that evolution produces intelligence by means of processes that we cannot mechanically replicate. The later run of thought might be taken by holding that it needed an enormously complex history that we could never artificially duplicate, or needed an enormous amount of luck. I think that's correct. But then he said, still I think that evolutionary argument made at least a prima facie case for its conclusion. I actually don't think it does. Chalmers appears to me too quick to dismiss this reason, right? The reason of human intelligent and conscious may well be extraordinary lucky event, as Stephen Jay Gould now called it a glorious accident. This view would, of course, not apply if one assumes an underlying teleological causality to evolution, relegating the luck of such causality to miraculousness, right? However, most evolutionary theories beginning with that of Darwin. Of course, that was one of his most revolutionary ideas, reject teleology. Evolution has no goal, right? Remarkably, the counter-argument that evolution, quote, needed an enormous complex history that we could never artificially duplicate is just dropped from Chalmers' analysis. He doesn't consider it at all without any explanation. While it is an extremely serious counter-argument. I'm not saying that this objection is necessarily insurmountable, although in my view, there's a pretty strong chance it might be. Chalmers does note that it must, now it's quite interesting, after he says that, he says, it must be acknowledged, quote, that every path to AI has proved surprisingly difficult so far. The history of AI involves a long series of optimistic predictions by those who pioneer a method, following by periods of disappointment and reassessment. Of course, correct, but he mentioned that only to conclude, still, my own view is that the balance of considerations still distinctly favors the view that AI will eventually be possible, without explaining why and which balance distinctly favors this view that it is possible. Why, if it is so, why has it proven to be surprisingly difficult then? Even a cursory analysis of, now, I'm going to proceed a little bit beyond merely practical difficulties. Even a cursory analysis of complexity of such system would suggest that it is not surprising, but rather to be expected, in part in view of neurological and evolutionary consideration. The human brain, as you all know, is an exceptionally complex neurological system capable of various manifestations or effects we associate with thinking and consciousness. The spectrum of this effect is large, and some of them are not sharply defined. Many of them, however, are well-defined and indicate the fact they are the product of this enormous complexity. So then the project and the problem of AI are those of creating a system of similar capacity, and hence it must be surmised, I do surmise, of comparable complexity. Now, the human brain has over 100 billion neurons, roughly the number of stars in a galaxy, each already an immensely complex and multi-capacious subsystem, better than the best iPhone. So with, on average, 7,000 connections from each neuron expanding to any other, which bring the estimated total to 100 to 500 trillion of synaptic connections between neurons and the human brain. I think in a way, even it's a great achievement, of course, putting many computers together for solving problem is so far away from that so far. I rehearsed these numbers, they all well known, in order to stress the immense complexity of our thinking and conscious hardware. We as human may not have either time or luck, or in the first place, to a capacity to create AI. Chalmers, before long above, refers to a century or so. It took evolution billions of years. It is true that we can proceed deliberately, teleologically toward AI. By evolution has created us blindly over 3+ billion years. Chalmers and others' idea is roughly that once we put enough sophisticated software created by human minds, we can enact a kind of accelerated evolution toward AI, which then will accelerate even further towards singularity. These expectations are based on the fact that the power of computers doubles quickly. Still, it was not clearer that we have, in principle, the capacity to ever develop the AI capability comparable to those of human beings. I'm not talking here about the capacity to solve all manner of problems. For example, the computer now relatively easily defeat the best chess player. That's why Garry Kasparov at some point says that even to win the computer against the computer, one game is a triumph for the human spirit, right? So I think, or if we don't, the question is not clear if we have this capacity in principle, or will be lucky enough, as evolution was, to create anything of comparable complexity. While we create computers, as I already said, that perform many computational tasks better than we do at present, there doesn't appear to be, to the present author, sufficiently compelling reasons to think that we can come anywhere close to the type of complexity and what human mind does, right? Or thought, rather, especially in Deleuze and Guattari. I'll come to that back momentarily. The spectrum of the intelligence-like effect produced by digital systems corresponds to a minuscule portion of the spectrum produced by human brains. That is to say that these tasks are tremendous and they achieve a work, but it's a very minimal part of human brain in principle is doing. In particular, is not clear at all how a capable computer or could be of probabilistic reasoning. As I noted, this is the crucial feature of the human brain and possibly some animals, and it shapes it essentially. The brain is a probabilistic system. Is this feature reproducible by means of AI? Thus far, AI has generally not dealt with chance, or at most deals with chance underlined by determinism. Imagine a simple example. Somebody is walking with a map in the area of a labyrinthine street of the city with great architecture. Let's say Venice, right? Where I would like to be now to give this paper. One can plan a trajectory ahead, but because nice building on other street one passes by, or for no apparent outside reason, one changes one actual routes, makes new plans, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. It is possible that the unconscious ultimately make all such decisions. So the question is, what kind of decisions and desire, say Freudian, Lacanian, or Girardian versus Deleuzian, or which interplay of this drive even this simple wondering? The answer, to the degree it is even possible, will be unique in each case. I would like to call it the irreducible individuality postulate, which I think is defined part of the hard problem, our consciousness, irreducibly individual, which is also in Levinas's idiom, the irreducible infinity postulate when it comes to conceiving one experience from the outside. For Levinas, the term infinity means actually inaccessibility from outside, which he sees as defined as finite. It's not any form of conventional mathematical infinity, although some mathematical concept has correspondence. Now, what I'm arguing here is that we do share the structures of desire, such as that defined, following Freud, who doesn't speak in terms of structure, by this is Freudian desire as a structure defined by the infinite distance from a fulfillment. There is therefore, if you design it as by that infinite distance from fulfillment, there is no point for movement, no chance for real moving, desiring machine, because the distance to fulfillment remains infinite no matter what, right? By contrast, our machine of desire, once they become desiring machine, in the Deleuze and Guattari sense, they also call them schizophrenic machine, but I want to avoid this form for the moment, as it requires too much explanation, are unique for each of us. They define our trajectory of movement through Venice or through life. So I think so from that point of view, so that's my argument is that the structures of desire we may share, but the actual machines of desire are individual to us, and they define probabilistically and possible changes. I think Aristotle was quite wrong to define humans as a mimetic animal, or only right in a very limited way. Mimesis, including the mimesis of desire, is an oppressive structure. A reductive machine, as actually, in my view, both Lacan and Girard tell us, sometimes against their own grain. It is an opinion machine. Mimesis is an opinion machine as defined by Aristotle, not a machine of thought. And as a conglomerate of desiring machine, we do not imitate in our desire. We create new trajectories of thought, line of flights, as Deleuze and Guattari call them, and change them. As Derrida, for example, shows in his wonderful analysis of, if I can put it that way, my misses without my misses in Mallarmé. So he deals with that type of interplay. There is always an unfulfillment of desire, unfulfillment, but in two very different ways. And Freud, Lacan, and Girard, because of the infinite distance defined by the structure of desire. And Deleuze and Guattari, because every point of fulfillment is always the point of a new trajectory of desire, a new line of flight. And the same is true for thought in general, which in Deleuze and Guattari sense, which is, I contend here, not possible without desire. A creative thought is always a flight. It's not an algorithm with a termination, although it might use algorithms for its flight. Will AI ever be capable to do so, to have lines of flight, rather than to follow algorithm we create for it? For AI, if I can put it that way, undesiring machine to help our lines of flight, even in mathematics. Mathematicians do not think like computers because computers are not capable of thought as a confrontation and friendship with chaos. They are not desiring machine, but just machine which don't pursue lines of flight by follow algorithms created by human. As things stand now, by acknowledging many tremendous achievements in this field, I would argue that what should not confuse, as many do, clever programming with thinking, especially with thought. As desiring machine, we are not desiring machines. For a more dramatic case, consider a poet. Consider a poet. It's a brief analysis of poetry, which I want to remind you that contrary to appearances, I'm also an English professor. Deciding between two or more words to use in a given line. A decision finalized by consciousness, but ultimately coming from the unconscious, almost sort of like at the final moment, an improvisation, as incidentally Niels Bohr pointed out at some point, even in relation to scientific papers. John Keats, in one of his most famous letters, first says head, then crosses head, a wonderful moment, and writes heart over it, speaking about, quote, sharpening one's vision into the heart and nature of man. So in a certain sense, he does it, he says, replacing head with the heart as, in a way, standing for what I called human inner experience, right? This gives further evidence, there are plenty of others, that in some of his poems, he was making and changing decisions concerning user of these two words, or between heart and brain and mind, or brain and head. All these words occur as each time selected versus other in his poetry. Sometimes they may appear interchangeable, but in most cases are not. Thus, in the Ode to a Nightingale, he opens with the famous line, "My heart aches, and the drowsy numbness pains my senses." This cannot be replaced with brain of mind, although in principle one can do that. The brain does, however, appears a bit later, the dull brain, which aims to, but cannot stop poetic thought as it flies toward the nightingale, a quote. "And I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his parts, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though dull brain perplexes and retards." This line are a remarkable description of the complexity of human thought and decisions, conscious and unconscious, our thinking makes, wants to make, cannot make, can make. Our brain often perplexes and constantly retards our lines of flight. This one quite literally a flight toward a nightingale, it delays and sometimes terminates the movement of our desire from point to point, each of which is a starting point of new desire. But so do our mind. Oedipal machines defined by single structure, and Deleuze and Guattari machines, which change their structure from one step to the next. So I think that in a way, T.S. Eliot, of course, knew Keats's letter, in one of his most famous lines in the love song of Prufrock, says, "Do I dare to disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions when a minute will reverse." Eliot's "Do I dare" is, of course, a decision-desiring question, and he repeated throughout the poem. Keats or Eliot, including in this poem, made and reversed their decision many times for almost each word written there, reflecting the unrepeatable qualia of our individual minds, which are created and create new desire in 1,000 decisions and revision that every moment can change and reverse. Can these capacities of the brain developed by its biological evolution can be developed by any technology, digital or other, or can they be applauded as some hope, which in effect will amount to recreating them digitally, right? So I think that I shall return to the question of applauding below if I have time. For the moment, it appears that no mathematical modeling of any kind is likely to capture this capacity, and there is no AI without mathematical modeling so far. As Richard Feynman once said, nature imagination surpasses our own. And nature obviously has more time and opportunities to use imagination, but then nature doesn't imagine anything and it makes no decision or estimates probability. We do. And without doing it, we couldn't create anything. I'm not saying, by the way, that the human brain is unique in the universe as concerns its complexity. Quite the contrary, I am inclined to think that the system of comparable complexity or even greater complexity and comparably complex effect exists within our galaxy, at least, right? Let alone in the universe, which has 100 billion of galaxies, right? So I think it would be more difficult to bet on a particular physical, biological-like, silicon-like, etc., base of such system, or on the processes by which they could be produced, or the effects in question, which are analogous to which we associate with thinking. Hence, I would not bet, as many would, on the possibilities of communicating with an extraterrestrial intelligence to prove anything but a dream. There is just maybe no message we could possibly construct that such extraterrestrial being could receive. This incommensurability is well beyond the question of deciphering the message. It really is a question of the radical incommensurability. So I'm not claiming either from these considerations that AI is in principle impossible. Remember, I said everything I say is a bet. But only that in view of this consideration, my own bet on its likelihood is far less optimistic than that of Chalmers or others. So in my point is that the reason for that is they do not adequately consider the reasons which I try to outline there, which makes these bets really quite different. I think that's one of the differences, because when you do science fiction, you do not have rigorously to go in this reason, right? I consider, for example, Sander, how much time do I still have? Sander, how much time?
I would say 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, fine, wonderful, thank you. I think I should be able to finish at 5, I'll try, right? Consider the fable which Chalmers offer following Derek Parfit concerning an artificially created copies of personal identities. So here's Chalmers. Suppose that yesterday, Dave, it's clearly the Dave from 2001, was uploaded into the computer. So think about the Dave being uploaded into how? the original brain and body was not destroyed. So there are now two conscious beings, Bio-Dave and Digi-Dave. Bio-Dave's natural attitude will be that he is the original system, and Digi-Dave is at best some sort of branch line copy. Digi-Dave presumably has some right, but it is natural to hold that he doesn't have Bio-Dave's right. For example, it is natural to hold that Bio-Dave has certain rights to Dave's possession, his friends and so on, where Digi-Dave does not. And it is natural to hold that it is because Bio-Dave is still the Dave. That is, Dave has survived as Bio-Dave. Bio-Dave is not as Digi-Dave. So I mean, it's a very nice fable in a way, right? Because it allows me to actually to dismantle it momentarily, right? So I'm not interested in the question what happens to these two Daves, which Chalmers tried to analyze, which is quite interesting, but it's not my concern here. What I want to examine instead is the likelihood of the possibility of such uploading something on the computer. First, although I can only mention it here, if thinking is informationally, even not physically, quantum, the state of consciousness cannot be copied by the so-called quantum no-cloning theorem, which has nothing to do with biological, say, cloning. That is to say, unlike when you copy the file, if my files are quantum in nature, you cannot copy them. And that's why there are very interesting things about quantum cryptography, which you can in principle decipher. So anyway, so any copying presume that our thinking is informationally classical because all we can copy are classical records. But thinking may be informationally quantum, or as Roger Penrose argues, even physically quantum. I would like, however, to address the case of creating an exact biological copy, not merely a genetic clone, by the way, that's a totally different issue. An exact biological copy, which is in fact not biological. Yeah, let me address first an exact biological copy, which I would contain is not essentially different from uploading as considered by Chalmers. Another way, my argument is that it may seem that you can just simply upload something from the brain through various techniques, but in reality, it's not at all clear that uploading something is different from creating ourselves by different means, right? So think about that in this way. We often think as evolution strictly, in other words, my first argument is, in reality, to create an individual copy of myself, you have to write the tape of evolution from the very beginning. So that in a certain, or in the creating digital copy is an equivalent of this process. In fact, I have more to say on that. We often think of evolution strictly in terms of biological processes. One might argue, however, that in reality, the emergence of life itself was a chance, was created by the prehistory of the universe about 12 billion years or 11 billion years rather before life emerged, right? So therefore, in reality, I would even argue, hypothetically, that in order to recreate myself as my individual human experience, you literally have to rerun the whole tape of the universe from the Big Bang on. But this rewriting is impossible, not only for practical reason, which is obvious, of course, but fundamental reason, because the origin of the universe is quantum. And it means that the subject of random fluctuations. And it means that if you try to create the universe anew, it will not be the same universe. So it is really, and I think this translates also in all complex systems all over the universe. If you try to recreate life, to start life biologically and proceed toward that, there is really no reason to think that human beings would be created in the process. It was a product of the tremendous chance. Think about that. If the dinosaurs were not extinguished 65 billion years ago, we would not be here. There would be no humans with consciousness. There were no this type of, these are obvious things, but there are much more subtle reasons, right? And in a certain sense, that it is really the role of chance and uniqueness of this type of things, which really makes it quite a different assessment of things, right? So I think in a way, the chances to repeat the history of the universe is 1 into 100 into 140 degree, which is to say 0, right? So I think that in a way, so that is, and I do argue that thinking that somehow, as Chalmers does, that downloading should be significantly simpler, this process is not clear, because we really don't know, because of the hard problem, how I download my inner experience. If I could put it in Levinas's way, my own personal infinity, how it could be downloaded. So, so I think that that's in a way, so I think that that's what makes it difficult. But to conclude, this cosmological consideration also tell us how unique each of us is. Life is a small bubbling fluctuation on the fabric of cosmos, but its development, even if not its emergence as life, some form of which, or as a comparable biological formation, may be more common, is unique. Each species and each one of us are much smaller bubbling fluctuations on the bubbling fabric of lives, which make any expectation of anything similar elsewhere, let alone any form of contact with such entities, an anthropomorphic, or let me say, biomorphic fiction. But the irreducible contingency of life and death on all scale of life, ultimately life itself, which will die at some point, makes each of us unique. One can always, at least in principle, build a copy of a machine, but never a copy of any one of us as a desiring machine, which again means that desiring machines are not machines. This also makes our thought, in my view, an unapplaudable on the computer, even if we manage to develop AI and singularity. At least this would be my bet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arkady. Thank you very much. At this point, I will turn to Nidesh, and then we will have some moments for questions from the viewing audience. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arkady, for taking us through this tour de force and for arguing in favor of human specificity and complexity over AI. I was a little bit intimidated, I must admit, when Sandy asked me to respond to your work, because I know that your work is located between philosophy, literature, and quantum physics. I'm fine with the philosophy and the literature, but the quantum physics, I told Sandy, I cannot deal with. And so Sandy said, don't worry about it, focus on the philosophy and the literature. And so I'm gonna take my starting point from there for my comment. And I should say that for me, it is really a pleasure to respond to you, because philosophically, I fundamentally agree with your premise. That is that AI cannot, or very unlikely, certainly not at the present stage, reach consciousness and desire, and that there is a complexity, an evolutionary complexity that is constitutive of the human brain that you map wonderfully, that makes our inner experience quite singular. I like the notion of inner experience, l'expérience intérieure, because Georges Bataille is as important to me as well, for thinking about modes of communication, what he calls l'expérience souveraine, la communication souveraine, that flows between self and other, and I might come back to that later on. But for the moment, just to say, I fundamentally agree with your premise, and here at KU Leuven, 2 months ago, we organized a conference on post-human mimesis. And we had Catherine Hales as one of the keynote speakers, who is also somebody working between the humanities and sciences. She's a literature professor with a background in biology, and she made exactly the same point you made. That is, as a biologist, it is naive to think that we can upload consciousness in the brain and disregard the evolutionary history behind the complexity of the brain. Our argument is that cybernetics and AI might, or those who do believe that this is possible, like Chambers, have forgotten the body, and that consciousness is an embodied consciousness, and the brain is part of that body. So just to say, I fundamentally agree with your premise, and I'm particularly happy to be your respondent because there are many overlaps between our interests. Deleuze is fundamental to your work, but you also mentioned psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan, Girard, and these are all figures that are internal to a project that I'm leading at KU Leuven entitled Homo Mimeticus, where I try to establish connections between figures like Girard, but also Derrida, of course, and Deleuze, in order to rethink mimesis. And so I will take some moment to establish the context for my question. That my question will be very brief, and it will be about the relationship between desire, the unconscious, and mimesis. But first, just the context. And I can start from something that you mentioned in your paper, the famous definition of Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy? Philosophy is as a creation of concepts in order to solve problems. And that is something that I fundamentally share as well. And I think that one of the many virtues of conferences like this one is that it encourages new mimetic theorists to develop new concepts in order to address problems. I mentioned in my talk the concept of hypermimesis, for instance, to account for forms of artificial intelligence that do not have consciousness, but have the power to alter human consciousness. It's not an hyperreal simulation, but it retracts on the brain and does affect the body as well. So that is an example. But what I wanted to remind ourselves of is that this definition of philosophy as creation of concepts as a genealogical precursor that I would like to foreground. And that is Friedrich Nietzsche, who of course is very important to Deleuze, but also to Derrida, to Girard, to all the figures that, Freud, of course, to all the figures that we mentioned. And it's a fragment of The Will to Power that I would like to read to you, written in 1885, where he says that philosophers have trusted in concepts as completely as they have mistrusted the senses. He's critiquing idealist philosophers, of course. They have not stopped to consider that concepts and words are or inheritance from ages in which thinking was very modest and unclear. That evolutionary history that you were mapping is there in Nietzsche, and I was glad that you mentioned the genealogy of morals, by the way. And then he adds, what dawns on philosophers last of all, they must no longer accept concepts as a gift, nor merely purify and polish them, but first make and create them. So here is Nietzsche on the definition of philosophy as the creation of concept, and I think Deleuze is in line with this genealogy. What Nietzsche also adds that I find important for the context that I want to set up is that philosophy is very often a personal confession, an involuntary memoir of the author, and so that concepts and affect somehow can go hand in hand. And I think that was also something internal to your talk. And for that, I'd like to give a very brief biographical confession that has to do with how Arkady and I first met in a taxi in Baltimore. And we were driving to Hopkins for a very special occasion. It was in 2017, and it was the 50th anniversary conference that celebrated the 1966 famous Structuralist Controversy Conference, where Girard participated, and where important speakers were invited from Europe, from France, specifically Paris, to introduce structuralism in the US. Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, of course, who ended up stealing the scene. And so I set this up for this notion of the creation of concepts and affects and biographies being important, because both Arkady and I, and we published then the papers in a special issue of MLN, and there's a journal where Girard published a number of pieces early on, ended up talking about Derrida, and from different perspectives. And my focus in that paper was the relationship between Girard and Derrida, who are very often considered as opponents, all for obvious reasons, just like sameness is opposed to difference. But as many have noted, or not so many, but figures like Andrew McKenna, for instance, noticed in Violence and Difference, these two figures, Derrida and Girard, can be considered as frères ennemis. Okay, they're antagonists that nonetheless have similarities. And I was interested in tracing continuities between Derrida's notion of the pharmacon and the Girard notion of the pharmakos, the two being structurally linked. And Jean-Pierre Vernon, by the way, was present at that conference, gave a paper on Oedipus Rex, talking about the pharmacon and the pharmakos. So I'm thinking about genealogy, and I'm thinking about how theories emerge, including mimetic theory, and Girard was present at that conference, played a key role with Richard Maxi and Eugenio Donato. And I think that this context is very important for the genesis of mimetic theory. And the concept that I would like to propose in order to account for relations of similarities and difference between thinkers that might appear as antagonists on the surface, but actually might have underlying continuities that do not fit the model of mimetic rivalry, because it doesn't lead to violence, really. It leads to creation, to creativity, to the creation of concepts, is the one of mimetic agonism. I take the concept of the agon from the Greek, from Jakob Burckhardt's account of the Greek, and the idea that intellectual confrontations can be confrontations that are a bit like in sports, like in the Olympic Games, who wins the race. And of course, the agon is central to the theatrical agon and so forth. And what I want to suggest is that a bit like Plato is in an agonistic relationship to Homer. Plato excludes mimesis from the poetry, but my God, he writes allegories. He uses myth. He uses Homeric strategies in order to exclude mimesis. I would like to suggest that there might be a mimetic agonism at play between figures like Girard and Derrida, and also Girard and Freud. And I agree with you that you can set up a continuity between the unconscious that is at play in Freud, in Lacan, and Girard, even though, of course, important differences need to be indicated. So here I come to my question. So that was the general context for my question, which has to do with desire, the unconscious, and mimesis. My reading of your paper and of the distinction of the two models of the unconscious that you set up, you could argue that in psychoanalysis, Freud, Lacan, and Girard, you have a certain notion of desire as lack, a manque à être, that leads the subject to find being in another, and mimesis plays a role. Whereas in Deleuze and Guattari, you have this virtua, this potential, these lines, creative lines of flight that are affirmative, that are productive. And you noticed that you disagree with Aristotle's definition of mimesis as human as being the mimetic animal, because it is maybe linked to this notion of oppressive structure, of lack and making of opinion as well. And I agree with you. My question has to do with maybe the affirmative side of mimesis. And for that, I would like to suggest and to hear your thoughts, if you think that Deleuze's notion of desiring machine and line of flight has affinities with Nietzsche's notion of the will to power, this productive dimension. Desire doesn't lack anything. It's a machine. C'est une usine, he says. And the reason I point that out is because Nietzsche in the will to power defines the will to power as a pathos. And that's the concept that I find gravitating towards as an alternative, maybe, or a supplement to mimetic desire, mimetic pathos that includes desire, but can be productive, can take subjects on singularities on a line of flight that doesn't exclude the Freudian or Girardian or Lacanian models of desire, but maybe supplements it. And in Deleuze, I think it's there marginally. It's there in A Thousand Plateaux, for instance, where he quotes Gabriel Tarde on imitation, flows of micro-imitation. And I conclude with just a quote from Thousand Plateaux by Deleuze and Guattari, where they speak of Tarde, and he says, Tarde was interested instead in the world of detail or of the infinitesimal. The little imitations, oppositions, and inventions constituted an entire realm of suprarepresentative matter. And then I add, it has to do not with an individual, but with a flow or a wave. Imitation is the propagation of a flow. Opposition is binarization, the making of binary flows. Invention is a conjugation or connection or different flows. So here you have a notion of imitation that has to do with lines of flights, and I was just wanting to open it up and see what you think about this production notion of emphasis. But thanks so much for your paper.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's a very important observation toward the end. Your whole presentation was very important, but especially the observation toward the end. Obviously, you know, even though it was a generous amount of time for me to present some aspects of my argument, which we do not always have. Yes, of course. Remember, I said Aristotle was only partially right. I didn't say, at first I say it was wrong, but it was only partially right. It's really a matter of emphasis. See, in a simple question is, and it's in a way a kind of Derridian, it's always, see, that would be my view. Here's the virtual, or even something in Derrida like difference, from which he said oppositions are not disappearing, they emerge, but their balance changes upon the differentiation. In fact, William James has a very similar idea. Let me just go to Mallarmé's mimesis as a really great example of it. On the one hand, there is, of course, always an element of mimesis which he creates, but the emphasis is always on creation of the new, on this capacity of betting on something new. I think what the structure of this, that's why I also said, both certainly Lacan and Deleuze and Girard suggested sometimes against themselves. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus say it, we learned it from Lacan, this multiplicity of signification, but then it sort of get pulled back. You know, that's why I say kids, a dull brain perplexes and retards, right? You can say that really if the mimesis propels the desiring machine, it forms a positive function. You know, for Deleuze, differential calculus is always a very big model. Remember, that's why you said infinitesimal changes in talk, right? So differential calculus conceptually, mathematics, is a very different story. You know, it's you know, I have, you know, I'm not very bright, but I'm well educated. I have a degree in mathematics from the University of St. Petersburg, which is, so I think the calculus is very interesting in that sense, because Deleuze, it's really small inflections, which could be mimetic in a way. You can say, like, one of the great ideas of the calculus, that if you have a curve, which is of course nonlinear, but locally it imitates the straight line, right? But it somehow produces its complex curvature, its kind of line of light. So I think it really is the balance of these things and the problem of the structure. And I think that that's why it was a structuralist controversy, because it was the problem of the structure. Even Levi-Strauss is obviously a structuralist, and his analysis of prop, he already makes this point of that type of complexity of the elements which go beyond this type of structure, right? So in a certain sense, you can say, and I want to comment by the way, because I see something in the chat here about quantum theory, but you can say that quantum theory is essentially not mimetic in the sense that, you know, people mention the so-called collapse of the wave function. It's really a matter of interpretation. For example, Niels Bohr never uses even this term. But one of the ways, what is interesting about quantum theory, it's not random. I think one is often confused randomness with probability. So the probability, if randomness bring elements of disorder in the universe, the probability that introduces back the element of order, which allows us to deal with this disorder, right? So I think that in a certain sense, quantum mechanics is much more about order, but the form of order it accounts for is very peculiar because each individual event is random, but collective events are not random, right? So I think in each case, in a way, it's always really a matter of specificity. Here, of course, in this paper, I tried to be rigorous in saying my basic claim is that there is no thinking without desire. In fact, it was suggested here before that machines don't desire. But I really think that it's a much better version of the argument like Demasia and others that thinking and feelings are connected. I think the desire is much more useful concept. Obviously, you cannot strictly define of desire. That's interesting in itself. When Deleuze and Guattari tried to define desire in Anti-Oedipus, they always use an example, as I did Justinian family resemblance. It says, is the Proust spider, is like Boutor sculpture, mobile sculpture. It's really about moving from point to point, which is not deterministic in the sense that in Girard, and then you say the distance, the issue is that this distance is infinite. As I said, there are two unfulfillment of desire. One, because it could never be fulfilled in principle, it's always toward the structure. And another one, because each new point creates new desire. I think that, and obviously in our life, we live through different models of that type. But the fact is that according to the Deleuze and Guattari, we have the underlying structures of the brain or inner experience, if you like, which allow us to balance them in a great variety of ways, including, obviously, I actually cite this passage from Nietzsche many times myself, that the concept are not created like Athena from the head of Zeus. They not jump out. They have to be rigorously created by the rigorous work, and no matter how innovative, they always have history. See, that's the thing, right? So I think that that's, in a certain sense, if you transfer this machine of desire toward the creation of concept, it is what happens. That its concept is created in the history of other concepts that moved forward. And according to Deleuze and Guattari, if you really have a truly philosophical concept, although I would argue against them, that it's true about science and mathematics as well, it is always concept which never stops to generate new concepts. Once it stops, it's dead, you know, and so it is. And we know very well that in development of science, the solution of very serious problem usually lead to further problem. But thank you very much for this question. I really think it is about a very complex balance. And I was a little bit asymmetrical in my paper. I gave more positive aspect to Deleuze, but in my work, you can criticize some of their claim, for example, from some of the aspects of the Derridian perspective, some of the ontological claims, which somebody like Derrida would not make. You know, there is this thing. But thank you.
So, okay, we have a little bit of time for questions from the listening and watching audience. And here's a question from Pablo Bandera, who we've heard speak, of course, earlier. Here's the question. A common understanding of how AI achieves human thinking is by increasing mathematical or computational complexity. Some researchers suggest that quantum mechanics provide a better model of human thinking, the discontinuity of the collapse better models, something like a human decision. But then all the problems of relating quantum mechanics to a convincing ontology suddenly applies to robots and AI. And here's his question. How do you think this relates to your arguments from the perspective of consciousness and intelligence?
It is absolutely great and crucial question. And I actually have a forthcoming article in part on that, which has to do, and I mentioned before that connection, that in fact there are these deep relationships that quantum, let me put it like this, still simplifying. Quantum mechanics is, in my view, a better model than any other mathematical physical model for handling the questions of conscious and which I discussed here. My claim, however, that it will not be good enough for in a sense, I doubt that, even because it is still a mathematical model. I think ultimately mathematical models work extremely well in physics, but all of mathematical models are the tremendous reductions of human experience, right? So I think what we can learn from quantum models is some of the aspects, new aspects of understanding of the models of conscious, right? That kind of interdisciplinarity is a transfer, or cross-disciplinarity is transfer of some of the aspects of understanding. I think quantum mechanics will give us an understanding. And, you know, one of the things that quantum computers are so interesting because they make calculation, but we really don't know how, just the way, in fact, nature, when you consider quantum measurement is a misnomer, because quantum measurement do not measure anything in nature. They create phenomena which we observe. So in that they show, as people like Richard Feynman and us, the creative capacity of nature. But my short answer is yes, it is probably the best so far mathematical model we have for handling consciousness, in part because also it handles interestingly from outside. You can say this, those who don't know quantum mechanics will forgive me, that you have the so-called ontology of pure states inside, but all the outside states are mixed. So if you predict it from outside, you can only do the probability, but your experience is the flow of thought. It has a mental ontology. So I think, yes, so that aspect of quantum mechanics is really very crucial, and there are very interesting papers in addressing hard problem from this point of view. But I just doubt, when I think about Keats's poem, which I discussed here, that the quantum mechanics will ever be able to account. You can put it in that way, that the phenomena which we analyze or which we consider relation to consciousness, which is produced by poetry, even scientific concepts themselves, how they are produced, just might be too complex. And if this is the case, the AI, which, as I said in my paper, is based on mathematics. I mean, so far, there is no AI without mathematical modeling. So if quantum mechanics, yes, it probably is better to use this type of mathematical model than classical model, but I doubt that it will be enough, but it's only a bet. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. This is from Curtis Grunler, who is, of course, the editor of the Bulletin of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion. And Curtis asks the following: the structuralist milieu of Girard's work seems to set up a binary between negative and positive mimesis. And we've heard discussions of that this morning. But it could be, Curtis writes, that conflictual rivalrous mimesis tends towards rigid, similar forms, but affirmative kinds of mimesis open up to many kinds, many forms. And he's posing this as a question: is that possible? Is this part of what the approaches to desire that you are both you and Nidesh are trying to bring to bear do for mimetic theory? So what he's asking is, how does this bear upon the analysis of positive and negative mimesis? Can positive and negative mimesis, which are hot issues within Girardian thinking?
No, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. From the I guess it's from from reading your books and also from the discussion here. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I have to ask. It depends. That is to say, you can say here you deal with the concept. New concepts were introduced, which to keep them alive, you have to continue to play them. If you want to make this case, right. I cannot make it in general. I think it's a good question, but it cannot be made in general. It could only be made by the specific conceptual work, which will produce how Girard's different concepts are put into interplay, which establish this proximity for, let's say, Deleuze and Guattari creative aspects of desire. That's why I said in my, very briefly, I mentioned in my paper that actually Girard and Lacan helps us to understand it sometimes against their own grain, because after all, Deleuze published right before his work with Guattari, The Logic of Sense. And some of the key elements of Deleuze's concept of desire and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus are actually presented in a logic of sense, the so-called synthesis of desire in terms of Lacan. So he really, it really depends what you do with that. That's in a way that in itself an inner philosophical experience. And I could back to Bandera's question that in a way, it's really artificial intelligence would have to be able to create concept, and it's driven by forms of theoretical desire, which emerges if you are a good thinker, not from independently from outside, but from within the structure of this concept. You know, John Wheeler is a famous physicist, right? And he said he had this concept, which I think is very good, which is called radical conservatism, which means that you create innovation from the concept while pushing the concept to the limit where they can still work, right? So in a certain sense, I can say, in order to answer this question, you have to answer this question, not to produce a concept or a set of concepts which says that, yes, there are in Girard's concept of desire, this type of element. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that they are, because Girard, you know, forgive me for saying it, Girard is not stupid, you know? He understands that he has to, in a way, there is a kind of mimesis of complexity in Girard. He has to understand that his concepts have to account for a kind of complex phenomena, right? And so therefore he modifies his concepts or inflects them in such a way to produce these possibilities, sometimes against himself, that will say against the concept which he introduced. Oh, after all, you know, take back to Freud. It's quite interesting. It depends which work you read. If you read an outline of psychoanalysis, everything is very clear, you know, it's very clear, very simple, there's no questions left. But if you go in this great essay, The Unconscious from 1916, you see how all these concepts are continuously inflected and produce this type of thing. That will be my answer. But it's a good question.
Thank you very much for a very rich and exciting presentation, Arkady. Let us thank Arkady, and we will conclude the session right now.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending. It's a very kind of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Arkady.
Thanks a lot. Then it's great to see you, Nidesh. I hope to see you soon live.
We'll have to continue the discussion in live.
Absolutely, yes. It's endless. Yeah. Thank you. It was very good. Excellent.
On that word, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.